At the heart of America is a dirty and shameful reality. Everyone knows it exists, but the devastating impact it has left on generations of people has been glossed over and even ignored, especially by those who still benefit from it. Our American history is rooted in racism. More obvious chapters include the decimation of Native American populations, slavery, segregation, and the Jim Crow era. Most Americans have learned about, or at least heard of these events. But ask them about the eugenics movement, or when homegrown extremists filled Madison Square Garden for a Nazi rally, or how Henry Ford's hatred of Jews helped inspire Adolf Hitler, and you're likely to get a blank stare. It's time to explore these overlooked events that don't make it into our history books and correct the record for the people harmed by them, to trace our past to modern tragedies and learn how folks over the centuries have fought back. We need to confront our racist history so that we might have a chance to defeat it once and for all. I'm Christian Picciolini, a former white supremacist who became an anti-racist activist and a bringer of hard truths. On each episode of F Your Racist History, you'll learn about America's conveniently overlooked racist origin stories. Join me as we yank off the hood and expose the lies behind some of America's so-called triumphs and heroes. This is episode 5 of F Your Racist History. P.T. Barnum's greatest exploitation on earth. Phineas Taylor, P.T. Barnum, ringmaster, businessman, politician. The Barnum Museum describes him as the most remarkable entrepreneur and entertainer in 19th century America. Today, he's remembered by many as America's greatest showman, a marvelous entertainer who could make something out of literally nothing, a so-called friend to the friendless, someone who employed people with physical and developmental disabilities in his circus during a time in history when they might not otherwise have been given any other opportunity. A businessman who was endeared and admired for his use of predatory capitalism. There wasn't a lie he wouldn't tell or a tale he wouldn't spin to make a buck. P.T. Barnum proved that people didn't mind getting conned as long as they got their money's worth. A shrewd business operator, Barnum became one of America's first millionaires. His legacy and name can still be seen everywhere, even in the modern era. Actor Hugh Jackman starred as Barnum in the 2017 Academy Award-nominated musical biopic, The Greatest Showman. It was a timely release at the end of an era. Barnum and Bailey's Greatest Show on Earth ran for 146 years until its last circus performance in 2017. But children can still munch on Barnum's animal crackers.
Animal crackers in my soup do funny things to me. They make me think my neighborhood is a big menagerie.
P.T. Barnum became famous during a time in American history when people craved spectacle. They wanted to feel something they had never experienced before. He rose to prominence in the 1840s, during the antebellum era before the American Civil War, when manifest destiny, the belief that Western expansion of the United States was both justified and inevitable, and a mad rush for gold had taken hold of the country. Average homegrown Americans were growing restless. They wanted excess. More land, more money, more freedom, more control, more fun. It was a time ripe for adventure when Americans began shedding the status quo like a snakeskin. People spread west with breathtaking rapidity while eastern cities bloomed into maturity. America's germination came with growing pains. Internal tensions would boil over by 1861. But the pre-Civil War years were the heyday of the opportunist. With new money to burn, upwardly mobile Americans were willing to pay for a good time, leaving them vulnerable to silver-tongued grifters. It was here, among the traveling snake oil salesmen, doomsday preachers, and charlatans, where P.T. Barnum found his niche. Phineas Taylor Barnum came screaming into the world on July 5, 1810, and it's safe to say, the world has not been the same since. He was the sixth of 10 children born to his father, Philo Barnum, and the first child of his mother, Irena Taylor, his father's second wife. His maternal grandfather, Phineas Taylor, was a notorious practical joker, and P.T. was named after him. This granddad deeded his namesake a 5-acre piece of property called Ivy Island in Connecticut. By the time young P.T. was 4 years old Phineas besieged his grandson daily with big talk of his generous land holdings. Until P.T. was 12, the whole neighborhood liked to remind him not to get an inflated head when he finally came into his vast fortune. When the time came for young P.T. to survey his future valuable land, he found 5 acres of virtual swampland, which was almost entirely worthless. His grandfather, parents, siblings, and neighbors all had a great laugh at his expense. In his writings, P.T. Barnum doesn't reflect on this with any particular malice, but it's not difficult to see how this experience could predispose a child to a life of deception and mistrust. Some might even describe Barnum as a pathological liar. In his adulthood, he had no qualms about telling outrageous falsehoods to make money. Barnum, the future showman, grew up in the small township of Bethel, Connecticut, where the people were known to be pious and hardworking. His father was a man of many trades: farmer, grocer, tailor, and tavern keeper. P.T. did his fair share of farm work as a boy, but hated it. He went to school by age 6, a rarity for working-class boys back then, indicating that despite the family's seemingly lean means, P.T. was still relatively privileged growing up. Privileged enough to say he hated physical labor, a cardinal sin in early 19th century America. As an early teenager, P.T. started work as a clerk in a dry goods store owned by his father. This position ignited his desire to make money, and when his father died in 1825, money-making suddenly became necessary for the 15-year-old. This was the genesis of P.T. Barnum's rags-to-riches story. His father's estate was declared insolvent and virtually worthless. The burden of helping support the family fell heavily upon him now the oldest of his mother's children. After his father's stake in the family store was liquidated, Barnum went to work as a clerk in a local general store for $6 a month. There, he proved himself an apt businessman, bartering and trading goods to his new employer's advantage and running a side scam: lotteries, with prizes valued at half the cost of the tickets, generating hefty profits. By the time he was 19, P.T. had jumped around from business to business, taking jobs as a clerk for various store owners and boarding with their families. He hopped through numerous other sales jobs, cutting his teeth and making a name for himself in New York. In May 1828, Barnum returned to his hometown of Bethel, Connecticut, and opened a small grocery store, like the one his father had before he died. Within a year, he married his first wife, Charity Hallett, with whom he had 4 children. For the next 5 years, Barnum expanded his business and real estate holdings in the area, many of which failed miserably. Dabbling in local politics in his early 20s, Barnum aligned himself with the Democratic Party, the old Democrats, the ones that supported things like the Ku Klux Klan and slavery. And he wrote extensively about his views for the local weekly paper. After they refused to publish his pieces, Barnum decided to cut out the middleman and created a platform to reach his fellow townsmen directly. In October 1831, he launched a newspaper called The Herald of Freedom, which he used to criticize members of his community he was feuding with. When he called out local church elders for usury, or allegedly lending money at inflated rates, he got slapped with a libel suit that landed him a hefty fine and 60 days in jail. He continued to run illegal lotteries until finally moving back to New York State in late 1834, when he left Connecticut with loads of debt and few assets to his name. Now, in New York City, PT needed to create opportunity, a new hustle. He scoured the city for fast money-making schemes, but only encountered other scams and scoundrels. Barnum was desperate. He managed to open a boarding house in May of 1835 and another grocery store soon after, until a fateful day that summer changed his life and career trajectory forever. In July 1835, while Barnum was working in his New York grocery store, a Connecticut man sauntered in and told Barnum he had just sold his interest in, quote, an extraordinary Negro woman named Joyce Heth. According to the fellow, Heth was the 161-year-old nursemaid of President George Washington. The Connecticut man's former partner, a Kentuckian named R.W. Lindsay, was exhibiting Heth in Philadelphia. He handed Barnum a copy of an advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer that read, "Curiosity. The citizens of Philadelphia and its vicinity have an opportunity of witnessing at the Masonic Hall one of the greatest natural curiosities ever witnessed, vis-a-vis Joyce Heth, a negress aged 161 years. All who have seen this extraordinary woman are satisfied with the truth of the account of her age. But the original bill of sale of Augustine Washington in his own handwriting and other evidence which the proprietor has in his possession will satisfy even the most incredulous." This was it. Barnum's spectacle. His big break. If he could angle his way into buying a stake in the old enslaved woman and display her for his own gain, he could stand to make a fortune. Barnum hastened to Philadelphia to meet her and her owner right away. Barnum was delighted with Heth's appearance when they met. She was old, toothless, completely blind, and partially paralyzed. He'd have no problem selling the con that she was 161 years old. On display, Heth chatted up anyone who bothered to listen, regaling crowds with tales of dear little George, from being present at the birth of America's future president to putting the first diapers on his saintly bottom. Her current owner, R.W. Lindsay, showed Barnum the original bill of sale for Heth from 1727, allegedly signed by George Washington's father, Augustine, for the sum of 33 pounds. Barnum proceeded to buy the exclusive rights to exhibit the old black woman from Lindsay for $1,000, 500 of which he borrowed from a friend. Within a few weeks, Barnum put Joyce Heth on display in a tavern in New York City and papered the town with advertisements for his new human exhibition. He made an average of $1,500 a week and soon had Heth traveling all over New York State, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. When audiences dwindled in one town or city, Barnum simply pulled up stakes and moved to another, making sure to use local press to announce their arrival in the new place loudly. Barnum quickly mastered the art of manipulating the media and honed his skills as a carnival barker as he worked Joyce Heth 12 hours a day. Once, upon their arrival in Boston, due to low ticket sales, Barnum published an anonymous letter in a newspaper suggesting Joyce Heth wasn't even a person at all and that P.T. Barnum was a fraud. It read in part, quote, "Joyce Heth is not a human being. What purports to be a remarkable old woman is simply a curiously constructed automaton made up of whalebone, India rubber, and numberless springs ingeniously put together and made to move at the slightest touch, according to the will of the operator." The letter whipped up even more public curiosity around the exhibit, and spectators swarmed. Not everyone was delighted with Barnum's dehumanizing spectacle, however. The Boston Courier newspaper said this about Barnum's exhibition of the old black woman. Quote, "Those who imagine they can contemplate with delight a breathing skeleton, subjected to the same sort of discipline that is sometimes exercised in a menagerie to induce the inferior animals to play unnatural pranks for the amusement of barren spectators, will find food to their taste by visiting Joyce Heth. But humanity sickens at the exhibition." End quote. When Heth died in February of 1836, Barnum organized a gruesome finale. He advertised her autopsy in the newspaper and rented out space in a New York saloon that could hold over 1,000 spectators. At 50 cents a ticket, a crowd of over 1,500 people paid P.T. Barnum to watch Dr. David L. Rogers hack Joyce Heth's corpse to pieces to see if her anatomy squared with the legend that she was 161 years old. She, of course, was not. And Barnum expressed shock when the doctor revealed to the crowd of awed spectators that Heth was a fraud and no more than 80 years old. He made no mention of Barnum's complicity in the scam, though. Joyce Heth helped launch P.T. Barnum's career as a slick and successful showman. But interestingly, and sadly, if you go to the Barnum Museum's website today, it fails to mention her at all. There's also no mention of Heth in the 2017 film about P.T. Barnum's life that features Hugh Jackman. Why not? This exploitation of a living and dead human being was the launchpad for Barnum's entire career. Doesn't Joyce Heth deserve at least an acknowledgement? Yet another example of the struggle to reconcile America's racist past with an almost pathological need to see ourselves and our predecessors as triumphant heroes of humanity. Most quick biographies of P.T. Barnum mark the beginning of his show business career in 1841 when he purchased Scudder's American Museum. He amplified the existing exhibits of wax figures and exotic animals to include hundreds of thousands of so-called oddities, and reopened it as Barnum's American Museum. At the time, American high society was still skeptical of mass entertainment, seeing it as lowbrow. Still, Barnum confronted this hesitancy head-on by packing his museum full of strange attractions to mesmerize his crowds. By filling it with so many strange exhibits, Barnum reasoned that everyone who entered would find at least one thing to give them their money's worth. He became a master promoter, decorating the outside of his museum to draw in and entice visitors. The facade of the building sported huge floodlights and colorful hand-painted banners advertising the absurdities inside. Barnum even hosted free rooftop concerts to get people on the premises, and then hired terrible musicians to drive them inside to purchase museum tickets to escape the racket. Barnum stocked his palace of the grotesque with a mixture of fact and fantasy. Exotic animals in cages were mixed with exhibits like the Fiji mermaid, a taxidermied creature constructed from the torso of a monkey and the tail of a fish. In his American Museum, Barnum got his first taste of real success with his freak shows. After that, there ceased to be a limit to the level of exploitation and debasement Barnum inflicted on women and people with developmental challenges to make money.
Let's all go to the sideshow. Come on, kids, let's go. At the Super Circus sideshow, you'll meet a lot of folks you ought to know. The fat man, the thin man, the rubber man.
He displayed living curiosities like the bearded lady, the human skeleton, the Nova Scotia giantess, the Siamese conjoined twins, and countless other human beings with various body-deforming medical conditions. In 1842, Barnum claimed to have discovered Tom Thumb. He marketed the diminutive boy as an 11-year-old English dwarf. In actuality, the character Tom Thumb was Charles Stratton, a distant cousin of Barnum's with congenital dwarfism, who was only 5 years old when he started being exhibited by Barnum. Tom Thumb was an absolute hit with the public, and Barnum even took him on tour in Europe, where he became a favorite of England's Queen Victoria. In 1863, Barnum publicized Tom Thumb's marriage to another little person named Lavinia Warren that became a public sensation. By some accounts, Charles Stratton's, aka Tom Thumb's, family feared for his future. But Barnum argued that he had essentially become Stratton's savior by taking charge of the boy and providing him with a means to make a living. This may or may not have been true, but Barnum's personal gains while exploiting the young man are undeniable. Before Barnum purchased the American Museum, it had grossed a total of $34,000. During just the first 3 years in operation as Barnum's American Museum, it took in over $100,000. P.T. Barnum was inspired by the human zoos he came across while traveling the United States and Europe. He saw how much money could be made by exploiting vulnerable people who looked different from his typical clientele, i.e., non-disabled white people with spending cash. Often, proprietors promoted human zoos as, quote, educational places, where, quote, civilized whites could come to gawk at people of color, savages, usually from African countries. At most of these human exhibits, patrons could pay an additional fee to touch the people on display, who were usually scantily dressed, if they were allowed to wear clothes at all. As these gross spectacles grew in popularity, World's Fairs and other large-scale events incorporated similar exhibitions. At the height of their popularity, an estimated 1.4 billion people visited an attraction or so-called family-friendly event that featured humans on shameful display. Seeing an opportunity to make money, Barnum searched for others to exploit in the same way. Barnum referred to the people he found for his acts as, quote, living curiosities. But he also referred to, quote, rhinoceroses, giraffes, grizzly bears, orangutans, great serpents, and whatever else money could buy in the same category. It's interesting to note that the human oddities Barnum proudly claimed to exploit in his autobiography were only mentioned by their stage names, not their real names, a further indication of his dehumanization of them. In one of his fabulous lies, Barnum claimed to have discovered the Siamese conjoined twins, Chang and Ing Bunker, in 1860. However, the brothers already had an extensive background, including about 30 years in the sideshow business before they ever met Barnum. They were born in Siam, modern-day Thailand, conjoined at the sternum. They were originally discovered by a Scottish merchant and brought to the United States when they were about 17 years old in 1829. There were rumors their mother had sold them into slavery, but the merchant and the brothers denied the story. Despite the discrimination they faced based on their race and appearance, the Bunkers made a small fortune allowing others to put them on display. They bought land and several slaves themselves. Eventually, they owned 18 enslaved people on their estate in North Carolina, including enslaved children. In 1840, they constructed an expensive home and announced their intentions to marry wives, which they did several years later. Chang and Ing Bunker followed all the rules of polite, upper-class society and felt very much American. Though they weren't considered white enough for the ruling classes at the time, they'd bought themselves many of the privileges of being white in America. They reportedly treated others, especially the people they enslaved, with ferocious cruelty. Another of Barnum's living curiosities were the Aztec wonders. Born in El Salvador, siblings Maximo Valdez Nunez and Bartola Velazquez were taken from their home when they were children. A trader had promised their mother he was taking them to get treatment, as they likely had developmental disabilities. Instead, The would-be trafficker sold them to a sideshow promoter who displayed them as the so-called lone survivors of a long-lost civilization. After over a decade as captives, dragged around the country on humiliating display, P.T. Barnum came along and incorporated the brother and sister into an exhibit at the American Museum. Other examples of human beings on display at the American Museum include Fedor Jeftachew, or Jojo, the dog-faced boy, a young man with a medical condition that caused an abnormal amount of hair to grow on his face. He was just 16 when Barnum pressured him into signing a contract that ensured he'd spend the rest of his life being humiliated in front of an audience to line Barnum's pockets. Chang Yu-sing, the Chinese giant, was a man who stood almost 8 feet tall and had previously made a living entertaining the Chinese emperor. Barnum exploited him too. And there were more. William Henry Johnson, a black man who was given the nicknames of Zip the Pinhead and the What Is It because of a tapered skull deformity, is estimated to have performed as a human curiosity for over 6 decades. Barnum often referred to him as, quote, his most popular African. Other than allegedly being born to former slaves, Johnson's actual origin story is unclear. One source claims that Barnum purchased Johnson from the Royal Surrey Zoological Garden for $3,000 in 1846, while another claims that Johnson didn't make an appearance in Barnum's American Museum until 1859. Posters advertising What Is It promoted Johnson as the missing link from Africa. A Currier and Ives lithograph print from the period reads, quote, "Is it a lower order of man or a higher order of monkey? No one can tell. Perhaps it is a combination of both. It is beyond dispute the most marvelous creature living. It was captured in a savage state in Central Africa. It has a skull, limbs, and general anatomy of an orangutan, and the countenance of a human being." End quote. Barnum played heavily upon the racist stereotype that Africa was a wild and brutish place filled with uncivilized primitives, gleefully dehumanizing an entire continent in the process. To him, it didn't matter where William Henry Johnson came from or what his story was, as long as he could play the part of a freak and keep the paying crowds coming. Reportedly, Johnson's last words in 1926 were, quote, "We fooled them a long time, didn't we?" Barnum was hardly the only person to treat black men as inferior, suggesting they were more like primates than human beings. In 1906, the New York Bronx Zoo put an African man named Ota Benga on display with the zoo's actual primates. Administrators sharpened Benga's teeth to points and made him interact in cages with the apes. Eventually, after heavy criticism from activist groups and some media, Benga was freed from captivity from the Bronx Zoo. He never fully recovered from the traumatic experience and committed suicide in his early 30s. So, why did P.T. Barnum and offensive exhibitions like his do so well, let alone exist? The quick answer is, they made racism fun for complicit white Americans, so it didn't seem as wicked. Barnum designed his exhibits to make them mystifying for the non-disabled white masses. They could show up at his American Museum or attend one of Barnum's traveling sideshows, see his acts being humiliated and dehumanized, disassociate from them as people, and join in on the ridicule with their fellow man. Good times. Barnum's freak show acts were not presented as being normal humans, if they were presented as human at all. And therefore, guests were given space to treat them with virtually no empathy or humanity. Barnum created the perfect environment for people to entertain themselves and feel better about their own lives at the other's expense. This environment and period in history was prime for racist, sexist, and ableist sentiments. Barnum began his shows when moralist politics and extreme religion were starting to gain footing in the United States. Where one robust set of values emerges, an opposing side always appears in resistance. The swing of public opinion towards abolition, early women's rights, disability rights, mental health care, and other initiatives saw fervent resistance. Barnum's shows gave people fuel to oppose these more progressive movements. And this sort of opposition and these preconceived notions have stuck with us. A quick internet search of P.T. Barnum's living curiosities will pull up hundreds of thousands of web results. Articles entitled P.T. Barnum's Most Famous Freaks and Barnum's 13 Most Famous and Incredible Oddities pop up at the top of the list. They contain image after image of the genuine people that Barnum exploited, or who are still arguably being exploited, and push the false narrative of Barnum as a hero of American ingenuity. Already a successful showman, Barnum then decided he would make an appearance on a different stage in 1865, when he ran for and was elected to the Connecticut General Assembly. He pursued a newfound role as a repentant Republican, who at this time were the Abolitionist Party pushing for a more liberal agenda, rather than with the pro-slavery Democrats, whom he had supported up until this point. He also admitted to some of his past indiscretions. Sort of. Quote, "I whipped my slaves. I ought to have been whipped 1,000 times for this myself, but then I was a Democrat, and one of those nondescript Democrats who are Northern men with Southern principles." End quote. But wasn't that exactly what Barnum was? He spun it well enough to stay in office for 4 terms, despite a failed bid for Congress in 1867. The political contribution that Barnum is most remembered for is his sponsorship of, get this, an anti-obscenity and anti-contraception bill. Aside from his stance against obscenity, which is just an obscene notion in and of itself given his track record of obscene and inhumane showmanship, he lobbied for and helped pass a stricter set of laws that prevented the use of, quote, any drug, medicine, article, or instrument, end quote, for the purpose of preventing conception, and criminalized anyone who provided information about birth control methods or literature about abortion. He effectively helped make women's lives in Connecticut miserable for almost a century, until these laws were overturned in the 1960s, after they were cited as privacy issues. Another aspect of his bigoted life that is not well publicized is P.T. Barnum's rampant anti-Semitism. Barnum wrote about once hiring a Jewish doctor to remove his foot corns, whom he described as, quote, a portly quack Jewish doctor with keen, piercing eyes, jet black shining hair, and the usual Israelitish countenance, end quote. Suspicious at the outset of the procedure, Barnum described being ready for this Jewish doctor to con him, purportedly due to his heritage. Barnum claimed he discovered the doctor trying to pass off kernels of actual corn as evidence of a successful procedure, then proceeded to kick the man down the stairs before deciding to forever warn others about, quote, Jew doctors. Another incident occurred while Barnum was mayor of Bridgeport, Connecticut. A newspaper reported that he went before the Board of Commissioners to accuse Jewish saloon keepers of violating the Sabbath, aka they were open on Sundays when they shouldn't have been according to Jewish law, and called them, quote, miserable Jews.
Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, in celebration of 200 years of Circus in America, the special anniversary edition of Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, the greatest show on earth.
Despite being best known for the circus that bears his name, P.T. Barnum didn't start the traveling show that became his legacy until he was in his 60s in 1870. It would be another 11 years until he brought James Bailey on board as an investor and partner in the affair. Although skeptical at first, Bailey made his investment back in one season. In 1888, after several name changes and tours worldwide, the two dubbed it Barnum and Bailey, the greatest show on earth. The Ringling Brothers purchased it shortly after Barnum's death in 1891 and kept the show running for 146 years, until 2017. Before he died, Barnum published at least 7 additional editions of his memoir, The Life of P.T. Barnum, or Barnum's Own Story, and any number of other names it was also published under. And he was constantly called out over his stated inaccuracies and fallacies. Facts don't line up from edition to edition, and he released the rights to his autobiography while he was still living to allow anyone to publish their own version of his story. Therefore, it's challenging to separate fact from fiction when discussing P.T. Barnum. Not letting criticism of any kind deter him, he also published The Art of Making Money in 1880, and The King of the Animal Kingdom, How He Caught, Tamed, and Ruled His Subjects in 1889. Barnum peddled his rags-to-riches story as the ultimate American dream, which became baked into his legacy. But it isn't exactly all true. He wasn't born into abject poverty like he claimed, and he died wealthy because he exploited countless people along the way. While his political career eventually developed in support of abolition, his actions before and even after demonstrated he didn't really believe in equality. To say otherwise is simply perpetuating an idyllic view of the man, ignoring his overt racism, sexism, and ableism for the sheer pleasure of nostalgia. Films like The Greatest Showman aren't the only pieces of popular culture to portray P.T. Barnum in a more favorable light than he arguably deserves. The movie Freaks debuted in 1932 and exploited characters with disabilities similar to those found in Barnum's sideshows. Likewise, FX Network's American horror story Freak Show recently found inspiration for several characters for its television series from Barnum's acts. While he isn't solely responsible for creating this brand of human exploitation, Barnum popularized it and made it more accessible to everyday Americans to consume. He's very much responsible for perpetuating harmful stereotypes and causing undue harm for over a century, not only to the people he was in direct contact with, but countless others over multiple generations. That's a lot to put on one person. But it also wasn't just him.
Hurry, hurry, step this way, the strangest sights on the island. Freaks from the 4 corners of the world. For 2 nickels, 1 dime, a 10th part of $1. We've got the show if you've got the dime.
If the American public at the time hadn't been more than willing to pay to exploit such racist and ableist exhibitions, Barnum wouldn't have continued to put on his shows. That's not an excuse for him, but he was after profits first and foremost, and consumers obliged. Our actions and treatment of one another matters. Where we spend our money and who we choose to support matters. And once we know better, we must then do better. Because if we don't, there'll be another racist sucker and more innocent victims born every minute, as well as plenty of new P.T. Barnums to take his place. That's all for today. Join me next time as we shine a light on another shameful chapter of our country's racist past. We can't beat the problem if we can't see it. You've been listening to F Your Racist History. If you like what you've heard, do us a favor and rate us on whichever platform you listen on. It helps. You can get more information on this and other episodes at fyourracisthistory.com or on your favorite podcast app. F Your Racist History is produced by Goldmill Group and distributed by Sounder. This episode was researched, fact-checked, and written by Maggie Coomer and Jasmine Brand. Links to source material and references are included in the show notes. Our editor is Ken Pendola. Music is courtesy of Flatfoot 56. Jamie Moeller is our producer. And I'm the executive producer and your host, Christian Picciolini. Thank you for joining. See you next time. And as always, F Your Racist History.